3 patrol cars surrounded my grandfather's lakeside cabin, their red and blue lights cutting through the morning mist like angry spirits. Karen Mitchell stood 20 feet away, pointing at me with her manicured finger while shouting into her phone about dangerous trespassers and threatened children. The officers approached with hands resting on their weapons, their faces serious and alert. I remained perfectly calm on my own front porch, holding a leather folder that contained documents Karen had never seen, documents that would change everything. The lead officer stepped forward, his voice professional but stern. "Sir, we need you to step away from the property. We have reports that you are trespassing on private HOA land." I looked at Karen's triumphant smile, then back at the officer. My voice was steady, almost gentle. "Officer, I think there has been a serious misunderstanding. You see, they built 96 homes on my land." The morning sun painted golden streaks across the still water of Cedar Lake as I sat on my grandfather's handcrafted dock, coffee mug warm in my hands. This was my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of the modern world. For 3 years, I had called this rustic lakeside cabin home, working remotely as a software consultant while living the simple life my grandfather had always dreamed of. The cabin itself was a masterpiece of old-world craftsmanship. Every log had been carefully selected and fitted by my grandfather's own hands back in 1967. The stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth blackened by decades of family gatherings. Weathered fishing rods lined the walls alongside family photos that told the story of 4 generations who had found peace in this quiet corner of the world. My grandfather had passed this land down to me with simple instructions written in his shaky handwriting. "Keep it wild, keep it free, and never let anyone tell you what to do with what your family built." I had honored those words every single day, maintaining the property with the same care and respect he had shown. The dock creaked gently beneath my feet as small waves lapped against the weathered pilings. Mountain peaks reflected in the mirror-like surface of the water, their snow-capped summits glowing pink in the early light. This was paradise, pure and simple. No traffic, no noise, no stress. Just the sound of nature waking up and the satisfaction of knowing I was exactly where I belonged. But paradise, as I was about to learn, can disappear in the time it takes to open an envelope. The mail truck rumbled down my gravel driveway just after 9 in the morning, leaving behind a stack of letters that would change my life forever. Most were the usual bills and junk mail, but one envelope stood out. Official letterhead, legal language, the kind of correspondence that makes your stomach drop before you even break the seal. The documents inside hit me like a physical blow. Official notification from the Cedar Lake Homeowners Association. According to the papers, recent boundary adjustments had placed my property under their jurisdiction. I was now subject to their rules, their fees, and their authority. The cabin that had been in my family for over 50 years was suddenly not mine to control. I read the documents 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood something. But the language was clear and threatening. Comply or face legal action. Pay fees dating back 2 years. Submit to inspection. Accept their authority or lose everything. That afternoon she arrived. Karen Mitchell stepped out of her pristine white SUV like a general preparing for battle. Everything about her screamed authority and entitlement. Her silver hair was styled to perfection, not a strand out of place despite the lakeside breeze. Her outfit was expensive and impractical for the outdoors. Designer shoes that had never touched real dirt. A clipboard that she held like a weapon. "You must be the property owner," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "I am Karen Mitchell, president of the Cedar Lake Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your numerous violations immediately." I tried to remain calm, to approach this like a reasonable person dealing with a reasonable situation. But nothing about Karen Mitchell seemed reasonable. She moved through my property like she owned it, pointing at structures my family had built with their own hands, making notes on her clipboard with obvious disdain. "This entire property is in violation of our community standards," she announced, as if delivering a court verdict. "The dock lacks proper permits. The cabin exterior is the wrong color. Your landscaping does not meet our requirements. And these rustic signs are completely unacceptable for our neighborhood aesthetic." I explained that this land had been in my family for decades, that everything she was criticizing had been here long before any HOA existed. But Karen's expression never changed. She was not interested in history or family legacy. She was interested in compliance and control. "I do not care what your family did before we established proper oversight," she said coldly. "What matters is that you are now part of our community, and you will follow our rules. You have 30 days to bring this property into compliance or face immediate legal action." As she climbed back into her SUV, I stood frozen on the dock where my grandfather had taught me to fish. The peaceful morning seemed like a distant memory. The sanctuary I had protected for 3 years was under attack, and the woman driving away held all the power. That night, I sat by the fireplace my grandfather had built stone by stone, staring into the flames and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The legal documents spread across the coffee table felt like a death sentence for everything my family had created. I had no idea that Karen Mitchell had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Karen returned exactly 1 week later, this time with a folder thick enough to choke a horse and an attitude that had somehow grown even more hostile. She marched across my property like a conquering army, her designer heels clicking against the wooden planks of my dock with sharp, aggressive sounds. "I have completed my comprehensive inspection," she announced, opening her folder with theatrical flourish. "The violations are extensive and the costs will be substantial." What followed was a systematic assault on everything my family had built over 5 decades. The dock that my grandfather had constructed with his own hands needed complete reconstruction to meet modern permit requirements. The cabin exterior had to be repainted in HOA-approved colors, which meant covering the natural wood stain that had aged to perfection over the years. The small garden my grandmother had planted needed to be redesigned according to their landscaping standards. But the worst demands were yet to come. "These primitive wooden signs must be removed immediately," Karen said, pointing at the hand-carved markers my grandfather had made to identify different areas of the property. "They will be replaced with standardized HOA-approved signage at your expense." Each sign told a story. Grandpa's fishing spot marked the deep water where he had taught 3 generations of children to cast their first lines. Sunrise Point identified the rocky outcrop where my grandmother had watched the dawn break over the mountains every morning for 20 years. Memory Lane was the path through the trees where family photos had been taken for decades. "And this eyesore has to go," Karen continued, gesturing dismissively at the small guest shed my father had built in the 1980s. "It violates setback requirements and does not match the architectural standards of our community." That shed was where my father had stored his tools, where he had taught me woodworking, where 3 generations of family memories lived in every board and nail. But to Karen, it was just an obstacle to her vision of suburban perfection. "The total cost for bringing your property into compliance will be approximately $43,000, she announced with obvious satisfaction, plus $15,000 in immediate fines for existing violations, plus 24 months of backdated HOA dues at $400 per month. I will need payment within 30 days, or we will place a lien on the property. The numbers hit me like physical blows. Nearly $70,000 to destroy everything that made this place special and replace it with generic suburban mediocrity. I tried to explain what these structures meant to my family, pulling out photo albums that showed 4 generations of memories attached to every building she wanted demolished. "Look at this picture," I said, showing her a faded photograph of my grandfather and grandmother standing beside the guest shed on their 40th wedding anniversary. "This is not just a building. This is family history." Karen glanced at the photo with the same interest she might show a grocery receipt. Her manicured fingers flipped through the album pages, dismissing decades of memories with casual indifference. "I am not running a museum," she said coldly. "I am maintaining property values and community standards. Your sentimental attachments are not my concern." She handed me a compliance checklist that read like a death warrant for everything that made my property unique. Standard paint colors, approved plant varieties, regulation mailbox designs, generic light fixtures. My grandfather's rustic paradise was to be transformed into another cookie-cutter suburban lot. "Furthermore," Karen continued, her voice growing more aggressive, "if you think you can ignore these requirements, you are seriously mistaken. I have successfully forced compliance from every property owner in this community. I have the legal authority and the resources to make your life very difficult if you choose to resist." The threat was clear and personal. This was not about community standards or property values. This was about power and control. Karen Mitchell had found someone who had not immediately submitted to her authority, and she was going to make an example of me. But then she crossed a line that transformed this from a property dispute into a personal war. "And frankly," she said, gesturing around the property with obvious disgust, "all of this hillbilly garbage your grandfather built is an embarrassment to our community anyway. It belongs in a trailer park, not on valuable lakefront property." The words hit me like a slap across the face. My grandfather had been a master craftsman, a man who had built everything with his own hands because he believed in quality and permanence. He had served his country in 2 wars, raised 5 children, and created a legacy of hard work and integrity that had sustained our family for generations. Karen Mitchell had just declared war on that legacy, and she had no idea what she had just awakened. That night I made a decision that would change everything. I was not going to submit. I was not going to comply. I was going to fight back with everything I had. And I was going to win. The county courthouse opened at 8 in the morning, and I was waiting at the front doors when the clerk arrived. If Karen Mitchell wanted to play legal games, I was going to learn the rules better than she knew them herself. The clerk, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, directed me to the property records office in the basement. The records room was a labyrinth of filing cabinets and dusty archives that held the complete history of every piece of land in the county. I requested everything related to the Cedar Lake area, going back to the original territorial surveys. What I found in those first few hours of research would have made Karen nervous if she had known what I was uncovering. The HOA formation documents were suspicious from the very beginning. The boundary change that had supposedly brought my property under their jurisdiction had been pushed through with minimal public notice during a winter meeting when most residents would not have attended. The voting records showed that only 12 people had participated in the decision that affected over 300 properties. But the real irregularities were in Karen's election as HOA president. According to the documents, She had been installed in an emergency election after the previous president had suddenly resigned. No public campaign, no candidate statements, no real democratic process. Just a quiet transfer of power that had given her complete control over the organization. I spent the next 3 days making phone calls to other affected property owners, and the stories I heard made my blood boil. Elderly couples who had been forced to sell homes they had owned for decades because of sudden fee assessments they could not afford. Young families bankrupted by compliance costs for violations that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Small business owners driven into foreclosure by legal fees from fighting Karen's demands. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Karen was not just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a predator who used her position to systematically target properties she wanted to acquire for herself or her developer friends. She would identify valuable properties, create impossible compliance requirements, and then force the owners into financial ruin. Once they were broken, she would arrange for the properties to be sold at below-market prices to her associates. I spoke with Jim and Martha Chen, an elderly couple who had lost their lakefront cottage after Karen demanded they rebuild their entire deck to meet new regulations that had never existed before. The compliance costs were over $30,000 for a deck that was perfectly safe and had been professionally maintained for 20 years. She destroyed our retirement, Martha told me over the phone, her voice shaking with anger and sadness. We had to sell everything and move into a tiny apartment in town, all because Karen Mitchell decided she wanted our property for her development friends. The more I dug, the more victims I found. Karen had been operating this scheme for over 3 years, targeting at least 15 properties that had been forced into foreclosure or distressed sales. The total value of the properties she had helped transfer to her associates was over $4 million. But the most damning evidence came from a former HOA board member named Robert Hayes, who had resigned in protest after discovering Karen's true agenda. She never cared about community standards, he told me during a 2-hour phone conversation. She cared about money and power. Every violation she issued, every fine she imposed, every compliance requirement she created was designed to force people out so her friends could buy their properties cheap. Robert had kept copies of internal communications that showed Karen coordinating with local developers to identify target properties. She would research property values, identify owners who might be vulnerable to financial pressure, and then manufacture violations to force compliance costs they could not afford. Your property is her white whale, Robert warned me. She has been talking about that lakefront land for 2 years. She knows exactly how valuable it is, and she has been waiting for the right opportunity to go after it. By the end of my first week of investigation, I had built a comprehensive file documenting Karen's pattern of corruption and abuse. But I had not yet discovered the most important piece of evidence, the document that would not only protect my property but destroy Karen's entire operation. That discovery was still waiting in the courthouse archives, buried in records so old that Karen had never thought to look for them. And when I found it, everything would change. The breakthrough came on a Friday afternoon when Mrs. Henderson mentioned the territorial archives in the courthouse sub-basement. These were the original land grants and survey maps from the 1800s, documents so old they were stored in climate-controlled cases and required special permission to access. Most people never think to look at the territorial records, she said as she unlocked the archive room. But sometimes the oldest documents hold the most important information. The first map I examined was a territorial survey from 1847, hand-drawn on thick paper that had yellowed with age. The ink was faded but still legible, and what I saw made my heart race. The property lines drawn in that careful 19th century script showed my family's original land grant, extending far beyond what I had ever imagined. According to the territorial map, my great-great-grandfather had been granted over 2,000 acres of prime lakefront property as payment for his service in the Mexican-American War. The boundaries extended from the lake shore up into the foothills, encompassing not just my current cabin, but the entire area where Karen's subdivision had been built. I requested every document related to the original land grant, and what I found was a complete paper trail showing how the property had been passed down through my family for over 150 years. My great-great-grandfather had sold small parcels to other settlers, but the core property around the lake had remained in family hands through every generation. The legal implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic and legally binding, then my property rights predated any HOA authority by over a century. But more than that, the territorial maps showed that I technically owned the land underneath Karen's entire subdivision. I spent the weekend researching property law and historical land rights, and what I learned made me realize that Karen had made a fatal error in targeting my property. Historical land grants like mine often carried special legal protections that superseded modern zoning laws and HOA agreements. Monday morning, I called the best property attorney in the county. David Morrison had been practicing real estate law for 30 years and had a reputation for handling complex property disputes. When I explained my situation and showed him copies of the territorial documents, his reaction was immediate and dramatic. "This is extraordinary," he said, studying the maps with a magnifying glass. "If these documents are authentic, you have one of the strongest property rights claims I have ever seen. The territorial land grants were federal documents with full legal authority that supersedes any local regulations." David spent 2 hours examining every document I had found, cross-referencing them with federal land office records and historical surveys. His conclusion was unambiguous. Not only do you have absolute ownership of your current property, but according to these surveys, you own approximately 800 acres of the land where the subdivision was built. The developers who built those homes never acquired proper title to the land because they never researched the original territorial grants. The legal strategy David outlined was devastatingly simple. We would file a quiet title action to establish my ownership of the historical property boundaries. This would not only protect my cabin from HOA interference, but would also establish that every home in Karen's subdivision was technically built on my land without permission. "This does not mean you can evict everyone," David explained. "But it does mean that any HOA authority over your property is completely invalid, and it gives you significant leverage to negotiate favorable terms with the subdivision residents." But before we could file any legal paperwork, Karen made her most desperate and foolish move yet. That Tuesday afternoon, she called 911. I was sitting on my dock, reviewing the territorial maps one more time, when I heard the sirens in the distance. Multiple patrol cars were heading toward my property, their emergency lights flashing through the trees. I stayed exactly where I was, the leather folder containing my evidence resting calmly in my lap. Karen arrived in her SUV just ahead of the police cars, practically jumping out of her vehicle before it had fully stopped. She ran toward the approaching officers, gesturing wildly in my direction. "There he is," she shouted. "The trespasser. He is threatening residents and refusing to leave HOA property." 3 patrol cars surrounded my property, and 6 officers approached with professional caution. I remained seated on my dock, my hands visible and my demeanor completely calm. The lead officer, a sergeant named Williams, approached with his hand resting on his radio. "Sir, we have received reports that you are trespassing on private property. We need to ask you to step away from the area while we sort this out." I looked at Karen, who was standing behind the officers with a triumphant smile on her face. She thought she had finally won, that she had found a way to have me forcibly removed from my own land. "Sergeant Williams," I said calmly, standing up slowly with my hands visible, "I think there has been a serious misunderstanding. This is my property, and I have the documents to prove it." I opened the leather folder and began to explain the situation, but Karen immediately interrupted. "He is lying," she screamed. "That land belongs to the HOA. I have the authority to have him arrested for trespassing." Sergeant Williams looked between Karen and me, clearly trying to assess the situation. His expression was professional but skeptical. "Sir, do you have documentation showing ownership of this property?" I smiled quietly and handed him the territorial survey map from 1847. "Sergeant, not only do I own this property, but according to this federal land grant, I own the land underneath 96 homes in that subdivision over there." The officer's eyes widened as he studied the ancient map. Karen's triumphant smile began to fade as she realized that her 911 gambit was about to backfire in ways she could never have imagined. The morning air was shattered by the sound of sirens converging on my peaceful lakeside property. 3 patrol cars arrived within minutes of each other, their red and blue lights casting harsh shadows across the water. Karen stood in the center of the chaos she had created, her arms waving dramatically as she directed the officers toward my location. "He has been here for days," she shouted, her voice carrying across the water with theatrical urgency. "He is armed and dangerous. He threatened to shoot anyone who tries to remove him from HOA property." The officers approached with tactical awareness, their hands positioned near their weapons as they assessed what they believed to be a potentially dangerous situation. I remained exactly where I was on the dock, my movements slow and deliberate, my voice calm and respectful. "Officers, I am the legal owner of this property," I said clearly. "I have documentation that proves my ownership, and I am happy to cooperate with your investigation." But Karen was not finished with her performance. She positioned herself between the officers and me, continuing her frantic narrative about dangerous trespassers and threatened neighbors. "Do not listen to him," she demanded. "He has been harassing residents for weeks. He claims he owns land that clearly belongs to our homeowners association. He is obviously mentally unstable." Sergeant Williams, the lead officer, held up his hand to silence Karen while he focused on me. His approach was professional but cautious, clearly trying to separate fact from fiction in a situation that had obviously gotten out of control. "Sir, we need to see some identification and any documentation you have regarding property ownership," he said firmly. "And we need you to keep your hands visible while we sort this out." I reached slowly into my jacket pocket and produced my driver's license, then carefully opened the leather folder containing the territorial maps and property documents. The contrast between my calm cooperation and Karen's hysterical accusations was becoming obvious to everyone present. "Sergeant Williams, this is a territorial land grant from 1847, I explained, handing him the carefully preserved document. "This property has been in my family for over 150 years. I inherited it from my grandfather, who inherited it from his grandfather." The officer studied the ancient map with growing interest, his expression shifting from suspicion to fascination as he traced the property boundaries with his finger. Meanwhile, Karen continued her increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. "Those documents are obviously fake," she insisted. "He probably made them on his computer. You cannot trust anything he says." But Sergeant Williams was now examining the federal seal on the territorial grant, the aged paper, the faded ink that was clearly decades old. He looked up at me with newfound respect. "Sir, these appear to be authentic historical documents. Can you explain how they relate to the current property dispute?" I spread out the survey map on the hood of the nearest patrol car, pointing to the boundaries marked in 19th century script. The other officers gathered around, their initial wariness replaced by curiosity about the historical significance of what they were seeing. "According to this federal land grant, my family owns not just this cabin and the immediate lakefront, but approximately 800 acres extending up into the foothills," I explained. "That includes the land where the entire subdivision was built." The implications of this revelation rippled through the group of officers like a shockwave. Karen's face went pale as she began to understand that her 911 call had not only failed to remove me from the property, but had also revealed the true extent of my legal standing. "You are standing on my private property right now," I continued calmly. "The HOA has no legal authority over land that my family has owned since before the Civil War." Karen made one final desperate attempt to salvage her position, her voice becoming shrill and demanding. "I do not care what those old papers say," she screamed. "I am the HOA president and I have the authority to control this property. You have to arrest him anyway." The officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing assessment of the situation. Sergeant Williams turned to Karen with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, based on the documentation we have seen, this gentleman appears to be the legitimate property owner. Filing false reports with emergency services is a serious offense that wastes public resources and can result in criminal charges." Karen's face flushed red with rage and embarrassment. Her entire strategy had collapsed in spectacular fashion, and now she was facing potential legal consequences for her desperate gambit. "Furthermore," Sergeant Williams continued, "if these property boundaries are accurate, then you and your HOA have been operating under false assumptions about your authority. I strongly recommend that you consult with an attorney before taking any further action against this property owner." As the officers prepared to leave, Karen made one last threatening gesture, pointing her finger at me with venomous intensity. "This is not over," she snarled. "I will sue you for everything you have. I will destroy you in court." But her threats rang hollow now, delivered from a position of obvious weakness rather than strength. The police cars pulled away, leaving Karen standing alone in my driveway while I returned to my peaceful dock. She had played her strongest card and lost everything, but the real confrontation was still to come. Word of the police incident spread through the subdivision like wildfire, and by the following weekend, I had an audience I had never expected. Nearly 40 neighbors gathered on the grassy area near my dock, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity, concern, and barely contained anger toward the woman who had terrorized them for years. Karen arrived in her white SUV, flanked by two men in expensive suits who were obviously attorneys. She had come prepared for battle, her clipboard replaced by a briefcase full of legal documents and threats. But she was about to discover that some battles cannot be won with intimidation and bureaucratic authority. I have called this meeting to address the false claims being made by this individual, Karen announced, her voice carrying the same commanding tone she had used to bully these people for years. He is attempting to interfere with legitimate HOA authority through fraudulent documents and intimidation tactics. The neighbors murmured among themselves, their expressions skeptical. These were people who had suffered under Karen's tyranny for too long, and many of them were hopping to finally see her get what she deserved. I stood up slowly, the leather folder in my hands, and addressed the crowd with calm confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you taking the time to hear the truth about this situation. What I am about to show you will explain why Karen Mitchell has no legal authority over my property, and why the HOA she controls has been operating illegally since its formation. I spread the territorial map across the hood of a parked car where everyone could see it clearly. The aged paper and faded ink immediately commanded respect and attention from the gathered crowd. This is a federal land grant from 1847, I explained, pointing to the official seal and signatures. It shows that my great-great-grandfather was granted over 2,000 acres of this land for his military service. That grant included not only my current property, but the entire area where your homes were built. The crowd pressed closer to examine the map, their voices rising in amazement and concern as they traced the property boundaries with their eyes. The implications were staggering and obvious to everyone present. According to these federal documents, which supersede any local HOA authority, I am the legal owner of approximately 800 acres of land in this area. Every home in this subdivision was built on my family's property without proper legal title. Karen's face had gone from confident to pale to absolutely white as the full impact of my revelation hit her. Her attorneys were frantically whispering among themselves, clearly realizing that their client had walked into a legal disaster of unprecedented proportions. "But wait," called out a voice from the crowd. It was Jim Chen, the elderly man whose cottage had been stolen through Karen's schemes. "If you own all this land, what does that mean for our homes?" I had anticipated this question and had prepared my answer carefully. These people were not my enemies. They were Karen's victims, just like I had been. "It means that the HOA has been collecting fees and wielding authority over land that does not belong to them," I explained. "Every fine they have imposed, every compliance requirement they have created, every fee they have collected has been done without legal authority." The crowd's murmur grew louder and more angry as the neighbors began to understand the full scope of Karen's deception. She had been collecting their money and controlling their lives based on authority she had never legally possessed. "I want to make something clear," I continued, raising my voice to address the entire group. "I am not your enemy. I am not going to evict anyone or disrupt your lives, but I am going to put an end to the illegal activities of this HOA and the woman who has been abusing her position to steal from all of us." Karen finally found her voice, her words coming out in a rush of desperate denial. "Those documents are fake," she screamed. "He is trying to defraud all of you. The HOA has complete legal authority over this property." But her credibility was gone. The neighbors turned toward her with expressions of disgust and betrayal, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and demands for accountability. "You stole our money," shouted Martha Chen.